Hello, and welcome to the Brave New Weed podcast. And now, here's your host, Joe Dolce.
Hello, Matthew.
Hello, Joe. How are you?
I am similarly good and strangely optimistic, given what's going on in the world.
It's an interesting time. I mean, I know that there's a lot of stress and emotions because of the holidays coming up, but
I was talking about politics. I'm going to recommend a book to the readers of our podcast. It's called On Tyranny. It's a mere 130 pages in a tiny little format, and it's one of the best books I've read about what's happened in the past and what might be happening in the present looks like. And I highly recommend it to any listener of this podcast. It's very
interesting. Do you know the author?
It's On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century by Timothy Snyder. He's a very smart fellow. He knows a lot about history. I highly, highly, highly recommend it as a quick thing to read. You will not be sorry. I'm going to give it to you for Christmas.
Oh, wow. Thanks.
It's okay. My pleasure. I'm going to give it to everybody I know for Christmas, as a matter of fact. It's about a $10 gift, and it's incredibly thought-provoking, and we need to read things that give us context, that give us perspective, that give us hope. And I think this is a very important thing to read without the interference of many screen ads and pop-up ads and things like that. Actually allows you to, it's a cute little book, fits in your pocket, carry it anywhere, and you can actually read it without being interrupted. How about that?
Sounds good to me, man.
Let's talk about some news in the world of cannabis. Yes, tell me.
Yeah, no, I was going to go right there because you said we need to, put things into context. And as we're reading over all our headlines this morning, it seems that our headline writers have forgotten all about context.
So which one are you talking about in particular?
Well, because we were talking about tyranny, the first thing up for me is that Jeff Sessions is, of course, back in the news.
Jeffrey Beauregard Sessions.
And I have to backtrack from our conversation last time because now the headline is that he is looking back at cracking down on marijuana.
Yes, but let's look at what's really happening, though. Is he really going to look at cracking down?
You see, I don't buy it because all of this rhetoric and all of this sort of hand-wringing in regards to Sessions' comments don't really align with what he's actually saying about marijuana. And he won't talk about cannabis by itself, other than to say, I don't think it's good. I think people should just say no. But when it comes to law and when it comes to enforcement and when it comes to the Department of Justice, we keep hearing these things about how it's basically fundamentally the same as the Obama policy and that they're looking for rational paths forward. So I just don't buy it still, but I guess we're going to see. The big key takeaway, however, is that December 8th sees the end of the budgetary stopgap measure that was taken back in September, which includes the Rohrabacher-Blumenauer amendment.
Which keeps the feds from stopping things going on with the states. But I have to say, okay, so no matter what Jeff Beauregard Sessions is going to do, there was another interesting comment from, remember Michael Steele? He used to head the Republican National Committee. Remember that guy?
Yes,
okay,
of course.
Never the brightest bulb, but he did say something interesting the other day. He said, in one sense, Jeff, I'm like, go ahead, do your thing, baby, bring it on. This is regarding Jeff Sessions. Because you'll have 18 states lining up to bring an immediate lawsuit pushing back on your crackdown. And that really blows up the conversation at the federal level. That's pretty stunning coming from this guy who used to head the National Republican Committee, don't you think?
I think it is. And I think it's really telling. And it's honestly a harsh truth. Jeff Sessions really needs a win. That's something that you've said a lot. And as all this other stuff coming out with the Department of Justice and Russia and all this, I just really don't see him trying to tackle the monster that is medical and recreational marijuana now.
Good. What other news interested you? Oh, I was interested in this piece I saw in Leafly. Did you read that piece about another study saying that the National Institute of Drug Abuse on how cannabis affects the developing brain? Did you have a look at that study, Matthew?
Yeah, I read through it. I found it really interesting. I'm still on the fence about whether or not these NIDA guys are on our side?
Their sole purpose is to look at the abuse aspect of all drugs. That is their purpose. They were set up by the Nixon administration to do that. Okay, so they have a bit of a bias, let's say, putting it nicely, going into this. This was an interesting study. I mean, again, talk about headlines, right? The headline I'm reading is NIDA study finds underage cannabis use alter brain's connectivity. And you read two sentences into the story, literally the second sentences, and it says, when it comes to cognitive tasks like memory or inhibitory control, regular cannabis consumers test just the same as non-consumers. So once again, you have a headline that's, sort of scary about the developing brain. And listen, if there's evidence about cannabis use and the developing brain, then we should know about it. We want to act on it. But my sense of reading an awful lot of studies about the brain is that everything affects the brain. Have a cup of coffee, have a piece of chocolate cake. It's going to have an effect on the brain, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the trick or the tricky play on words with the causation correlation that the study did find is that there is some sort of correlation between cannabis consumers and negative emotions. And they found that the younger people began to consume cannabis, the worse the presence of these negative feelings.
And that makes sense to me. I have to say, when I started using cannabis, I was very young. I was around 13. Obviously, it was a different plant back then. It was very weak and very shitty. But I did it because I was an awkward, weird, strange teenager. And it actually numbed it a bit. It actually took it away. And it made me feel a little better. I thought it was self-medicating. I would absolutely say I was one of those teenagers who had more negative feelings about myself than maybe you did.
Yeah, and it's hard to point at that correlation and say that the cannabis use caused it. And in fact, the study does recognize that. The only thing that they could find was an actual statistical measure called the IFCD, or the LFCD, my apologies, which is the local functional cognitive density. And they say, okay, our cannabis consumption users have a lower measurement of this density, and non-users had a higher measurement.
Like sort of a red herring. I mean, what's it telling us about network connectivity in a region of the brain?
Right. Well, the cool takeaway for me there is, according to the study, after the age of 21, that difference no longer exists.
Because the brain isn't developing anymore. Exactly. I mean, from there on in, Matthew, it's all downhill. Let's face it. The brain is impossible.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and that we know to be a fact.
So it is a good takeaway here from this study to learn that we're zeroing in on this sort of safe age of brain development. We talk about alcohol is legal at 21 or 18. Are they going to make cannabis 21, 18?
Yeah.
And it seems
mostly 21.
Yeah, it seems to indicate here that after 21, there's just
there is an effect. There's definitely an effect. Let's not say that. And there's many effects. The studies have always shown that the effects of psychoactivity, except for extreme use, are temporary. They go away when you stop using. But that's a topic for another podcast, which I'd love to explore, by the way.
Great. Should we talk about something kind of fun and fancy? There was recently a historic event in Toronto, Canada. Canada celebrated its Canadian Cannabis Awards.
How nice. And what happened there?
Well, black tie gala, in which two major cannabis producers in Canada took away the grand amount of rewards, MedRelief and Organigram, for best CBD strain and best THC flower, respectively. So any of our cannabis connoisseurs in the Great North, keep your eyes out for a THC strain called Aaron Almag, because that's apparently the best cannabis.
That's an Israeli strain from Tikkun Olam. It was named after a guy who died. I think he had AIDS. Aaron Almag. Yep. But I can tell you, I've tried that strain. I cannot believe that won an award. No offense, it is just not remarkable. The Israelis, bless them, have been using the same genetics for many, many years. And what happens with cannabis genetics is they tend to get a little played after about 6-7 years. So they got to up their game a little bit. I'll just tell you that.
The big hit of the night, though, was the on-site vape lounge, in which medical cannabis patients in Canada who could produce a card were allowed to vaporize with a wide array of portable vapes as long as they brought their own bud.
Well, there you go. It's probably going to be a part of Canada's future. Oh, Canada. This week's podcast features Pamela Hadfield. She's one of the founders of Hello MD, which is a telemedicine site which helps patients in California and in New York find recommendations to doctors. That's interesting in and of itself. It's sort of the future of lots of medicine. But what I found most interesting about Pamela is that she suffered from terrible headaches, terrible migraines for a long part of her life, and through her doctor became an opioid addict. And it messed with her something fierce. This is not the profile. This is not the kind of woman who looks like what you might think an opioid addict looks like, which is the secret and special thing about opioid addicts. They're everywhere. It's very hard to get off these drugs. And the reason Hello MD went into a pure cannabis prescriptive mode, I should say, one of the reasons is that Pamela actually helped wean herself off of opioids through using cannabis. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. So it's topical, it's interesting, and here we have, just a personal account of just how scary these opioid meds are and how difficult it is, even for the best of us, to get off of them. Pamela, how long has Hello MD been going for now?
So Hello MD pivoted into the cannabis space about 3 years ago.
Where was it before?
So prior to moving into the cannabis space and offering patients in California the ability to connect with a doctor over telehealth, we actually had a traditional healthcare platform connecting patients with doctors. So if you wanted the best neurologist, the best cardiologist, we would connect you, and then you'd be able to talk to them over video online.
And why the cannabis space? Was there anything personal? Most people I know in medical cannabis come from a personal condition, come from a personal motivation.
Absolutely. I often say that people are motivated to come into the cannabis industry, either because they've had a medical condition or somebody that they know has been affected by a medical condition and cannabis has helped them, or they're just passionate about the plant. So for me, I had migraines for 25 years. I had gone to every different kind of specialist. I was in a lot of pain, and in my late 30s, I found that rather than getting better, they were getting worse. I ended up having fibromyalgia, which, as everyone probably knows, is this sort of unknown origin of pain, which means absolutely nothing. Right? And can be, on the scale of 1 to 10, it could be anywhere in there in terms of pain, but I wasn't in good shape. And so the medicine that I ended up settling on at that time was Vicodin, which, as we know, is extremely addictive. But it was one of the only things that was allowing me to function.
You could actually function, do your job with taking Vicodin?
Correct. However, I was a highly functional narcotics user, as you would say. And I think that's an important point to clarify, because a lot of people that use opioids are highly functioning, and we don't actually think about that.
I want to talk a lot about opioids, but finish your story, please.
Yeah, so I was getting scared that I was on a fast path to addiction. So when a friend mentioned to me, oh, you should try cannabis, I scoffed it off, but really I had no other option, which is why I often say that cannabis is the medication of last resort. So it was the medication of last resort to me. I went and tried it. I ended up on a high CBD regime, and I was managing my pain effectively. Within 3 months, I was seamlessly dropped Vicodin, and within 6 months, I was preventing migraines. And since that time, 3.5 years ago, I have not had a migraine since.
Amazing. That is an amazing story. Now, there's many different types of migraines, right?
Mm-hmm. Mine, I believe, were hormonally generated. And as you know, throughout your life, males and females, your hormones, they change. And a lot of different aspects of your life can affect migraines. And so I made a lot of dietary changes, lifestyle changes, but the biggest change to me was the introduction of cannabis. And it was the only thing, and has been the only thing, that has stopped the migraines, period.
So you're lucky you're based in California,
yes,
where life
where CBD is a known quantity. How did you find your way to A, a medical provider to help you, and B, to CBD?
So when my friend had mentioned that I should try cannabis, the only pathway to legal cannabis in California is to go and see a doctor in person or now over telehealth, which is what we do, but at HelloMD. However, at the time, I went to an office. I saw a doctor there. It was a really uncomfortable experience. I mean, you could have said his name was Dr. Toke, you know? It was like that. It was a classic kind of experience of walking into a very cramped space. Everyone was congratulating me for getting my medical card before I even got it. It was not private at all. It was just...
Was it painted institutional green?
No, but it could have been. So I got my medical card, but to answer your question, I was extremely fortunate because when I looked online to see the dispensary to go to, I wanted to see a picture. And I found a picture of a dispensary and I said, that looks like a place I would shop.
Apothecarium?
So it was Apothecarium.
Apothecarium in San Francisco, the most beautifully designed dispensary maybe in America, right?
I think I chose it because I really liked the wallpaper. But I ended up going to Apothecarium and talked to a bud tender there. And it altered the course of my life because the cannabis consultant was so incredibly informed, and I said, listen, I have a very low tolerance to THC. It's always made me paranoid and anxious. So I'm uncomfortable even being here because I don't know if there's a solution for me. And that's when he introduced me to CBD, which I had no idea about. And so he put me on a high ratio of 20-to-1 CBD. Drops, tinctures. I believe he gave me some gummies, which didn't really work for me, but the tinctures did. And so over the next 6 months, I played around a lot, and like with so many cannabis patients, people that are new to cannabis, to find the right formula for you takes a while. And on average, when I talk to people, it takes usually about anywhere from $1,000 to $1,500 of product testing to dial that in. So I was fortunate, and after that point where I had the aha moment, the next aha moment was, well, let's transition our current business into cannabis because we were servicing traditional healthcare and we were doing it successfully. But I thought, and my co-founder, Mark, also thought that this was the real opportunity, was to help people who really needed that help of, finding out about cannabis. And so we were the first in the market to offer telehealth in California, connecting patient to doctor so that you could see your doctor over video.
And you do it in New York for cannabis now too, amazingly.
Yeah, so we were able to launch in New York, but over time also we realized very quickly that once we launched our telehealth service that there was a lot more to offer to people and patients. So we started to generate a tremendous amount of static content, educational. We launched what's called the Answers platform, which has been called by TechCrunch the Quora of cannabis. And we're focusing heavily now on communities, and in California we'll also be offering a marketplace, but very excited about being in New York.
Great. I know you should be, and New York really needs it, believe me. So one of your partners at one point said people have a sense that the medical side of cannabis is sort of a ruse for recreational. Is that still the case?
I think it depends on who you talk to. I think I'm always surprised when I go out and speak to people, especially people who are in a decision-making sort of capacity in our society, and they come back to me and they say that. They basically say, well, we all know that medical marijuana is a joke. And I'm always taken aback because to me, if I hadn't been given the access and the opportunity, I would be addicted to an opioid right now. So to me, instead of getting offended, I start to think of it, well, this is obviously an opportunity to educate one more person. And one more person needs to know that, yes, people do use marijuana and cannabis to have a good time, but the true recreational, what I call the quote-unquote stoner Dave population, which is younger male, 18 to 25, really just wants to get high all the time. Don't have an issue with that, but that's about 10% of the population of total consumers. The real opportunity and where cannabis is moving now is into mainstream America, and that's in the health and wellness space.
And listen, for people, anybody over 40, it's a godsend. It really does help with the fact that the unavoidable recognition that your body is starting to break down.
Yeah.
And it helps with this, right? It helps for me with pain, it helps with insomnia, it helps with many, many issues.
Absolutely. And I think that the interesting thing is if you start to think of a spectrum of recreational to medicinal, right to left, if you started out as an adult use consumer recreationally, often as you age, you start to realize, oh, wait, this is helping me with my insomnia. This is helping me with my joint pain. And if you start out more on the medical side, like myself with migraines, I've started to understand that, I actually can enjoy this recreationally on a Friday night. Instead of a glass of wine, I microdose THC, and I'm not excessively high, but I'm just relaxed.
Tell me how you microdose, because this is the word that everybody's talking about, obviously, and I'd like to know I know how I do it. I do it very minimally in 2.5 milligram doses. How do you do it?
Exactly like that. It's interesting that you would say that. So microdosing is really what you're trying to create is a specific effect. You want to just have enough to create whatever effect that you want. And that typically is in a small increment. So a typical microdose would be anywhere from 2 milligrams to 5 milligrams of THC, which is fairly easy to do in an edible or a tincture. Mm-hmm. Not so easy to do if you're smoking, smoking or vaping. So to me, microdosing is really understanding what your THC tolerance is and understanding the cadence to which you would want to take that amount.
Cadence?
The cadence or the tight habit.
No, that's a very interesting word to use.
Yeah, so for me, a microdose would typically be, if I'm playing with THC and I just want to relax, I would start with a 2.5 milligram dose. If it's an edible, that might take an hour and a half to feel it, and depending on if you've eaten or not. And then I'll microdose 1 milligram every hour thereafter.
1 milligram?
1 milligram, and it's enough. I'm incredibly lightlight.
Yeah, that's wonderful, though. I mean, I believe that medical use is about finding the lowest possible use. I mean, many doctors think this, also medical providers, that you find the lowest possible dose and try to stay there because you don't want to increase your threshold.
Right.
How do you take the 1 milligram? In a drop form?
No, I actually, I live in California, and so I'm fortunate to have a brand called Satori out near me. And there are lots of wonderful, wonderful microdosed brands out in California now, and I take Kiva as well. But Satori I like because you can buy a box of edibles, multiple boxes of edibles, from anywhere from 1 milligram, 2 milligrams, 3 milligrams.
I didn't know they had one.
5 milligrams,
and
6 milligrams, and 10 milligrams. And so I think it's a great onboarding mechanism to the canna-curious or the new to cannabis, because they can titrate, and myself, I can titrate my own medication. And in terms of THC, the interesting thing too is I've been talking about it in a recreational way, but if I have too much THC, it actually creates pain in my body, and that does happen.
It does. That's because it's a biphasic medication.
Yes,
and
if I have pain, it can actually exacerbate the pain. But if I'm in pain for whatever reason, like I've hurt my back, I'll titrate small microdoses of THC, and it helps the pain. So that's the interesting thing about THC. Everyone's different. Other people would be macrodoses of THC might help them in acute pain situations.
I mean, I have to say, I thought the Satori, the fact that they make different sizes and they fill them with different flavors, right? So 1 milligram is a little strawberry, 2.5 is a blueberry, 5 milligrams is a very clever way of making it clear to patients what they're taking, right?
Exactly.
Explain the biphasic effect to people who might be listening to us, because it's a very interesting effect.
Well, I think the biphasic effect is most easily talked about when you think about drinking alcohol. And I never like to compare alcohol to cannabis because they're completely different animals. But everyone knows that if you sit down and you drink a whole bottle of white wine or red wine, the likelihood is you're going to feel terrible and you're going to be extremely drunk. On the other side, if you have a glass of wine, you will probably feel okay. So the biphasic effect is essentially creating the right effect for your body where you go just to the right place and not over. So 1 glass of wine, you feel great. 2 glasses of wine, you feel a little tipsy. 3 glasses of wine, all of a sudden you feel drunk and you go over the edge, and the biphasic effect is that you've gone too far and you feel terrible. So it's just about understanding dosing.
Yes, it is.
It's about understanding dosing and the effect you want to create and going to that right place and not over.
I think dosing is the amazing secret to cannabis, really. It's what changed my attitude completely about it. Once I realized, I could really control this. You can actually figure out your dose.
Right.
I can control this, and then you find your levels, and then you're happy to be at that level, aren't you? Yeah. There's this whole macho thing about having to take a lot or to smoke big bong hits.
Yeah.
I think that's just a sort of an artifact, don't you, of another culture, another time.
I think it's an artifact of another culture and another time, but I think that there's just a general lack of education. Like, to me, the whole notion of dosing in cannabis, even though I'd been exposed to it for years and years and years, I never understood that if you're given a joint, that it's not like you smoke the whole thing.
Not anymore.
And I think everyone sort of was brought into cannabis with the notion of macrodosing without even realizing it.
Well, when I was younger, look, you would smoke 10 joints and you would never get very high because the pot was quite mild, quite general. That, of course, has changed.
Yeah.
And I actually miss that ritual of being able to share a joint or smoke a joint and get through the whole movie.
Yeah.
I can't do that anymore.
I think the way that you're able to do that, or what's similar to the way joints used to be, because the THC content in a typical joint used to be about, or I can't say a joint, in terms of the strain, used to be about 6%.
That's right.
And now it's up at about 20.
That's right.
So the way that you create that same effect that you would have years ago would be to have a 1-to-1 ratio of CBD to THC.
Which again, you have to basically live in California.
Basically you would need to live
but lucky you that you
west
can.
of the Rockies, as I say.
So look, Hello MD puts doctors together with patients and other medical providers with patients. How do you overcome what I have found is the unbelievable stodgy MD resistance to botanical medicine? Or do you not bother to overcome it? Do you just work with other different kinds of medical providers?
I think that initially when we moved into this space, what we found was that it was actually challenging to find qualified doctors that were at a certain level, because we wanted to provide a certain level of service, and that was 3 years ago. What we found now, 3 years into the game, is that more and more physicians are more and more interested. So that might mean that physicians are now starting to take courses. Maybe they're not really willing to be the quote unquote what they call a pot doc, because that's a lot in their mind. They have a stigma they have a stigma of giving recommendations from their own practice, I think, because they don't want to be known as that. They'd much rather refer people elsewhere, if they're referring at all. So this is a progressive doctor I'm talking about. And then they're also concerned about general liability. Mm-hmm. But what I'm finding in today's world is that doctors are becoming more and more curious, but there's still a limitation, because even though there's tons of data and research, even though people say, there's not enough research, there's not enough data. The problem is there's not enough data and research from our major institutions in the United States, and without those, most doctors won't pay attention. But we are finding more and more doctors are willing to become educated. But the question is, what's their pathway to that education? Who's informing them of where to go and what that education should be?
I have an idea about that. We'll talk about. I have found actually that sort of integrative doctors or doctors of osteopathy are a little more open, a lot more open. Mm-hmm. Let's face it.
Yeah.
They're not afraid of botanical medicines, and I always say to doctors when they talk to me, it's like, hey, look, if you're diabetic, you're testing your blood every single day and you're adjusting your dose. And that's self-analysis. A patient is doing that. If you have pain and you're using a drug like Neurontin, you're adjusting your dose every day mm-hmm. based on your body. And working with botanical medicine like cannabis is the exact same idea.
Yeah.
I find that gives them a bit of an on-ramp to working with botanical medicines.
I think it's interesting. Because it is you pose something that's important to talk about, which is that doctors are used to working with pharmaceuticals, typically pills, and they're given very clear, definitive guidelines. And so I think cannabis is not that. It's a lot more fluid with how people work with it, but I think it's also important to note that I think there's a lot of hesitation with traditional physicians because they are prescribing traditional meds and they wonder what the interaction is even going to be.
Yes.
And so I've heard from a lot of people and from doctors that they often will state to their patients, if you want me to consult you, it's an either or. You either take cannabis or you take your traditional medication. So for instance, in pain management, I've heard that. So that's not everybody, but that is something that
Well, that's such a shame because now I want to talk about opiates and I want to talk about some research that I've done.
Yeah.
And one of the statistics is that there's a great synergy between cannabis and opiates. The cannabis actually augments the effects of opiates, but without the addictive qualities.
Correct.
And that cannabis can also prevent the development of opiate tolerance,
Yes.
which is very interesting. So
Yeah.
let's talk about what you've learned about the connection and the synergy, because this is a major crisis.
It's a huge crisis.
And, we had Donald Trump, the Cheeto-in-chief, saying, hey, we're going to produce some really big, great advertising aimed at young people, because if you can teach young people not to take drugs, it's really, really easy not to take them. And we have about 40 years of just say no policies to say that is a load of shit.
Yeah.
Let's talk about what you've learned with opiates and cannabis.
We've learned a lot. So, obviously my personal story was the motivator for us to switch into cannabis, which was getting off of opioids using cannabis. So we always had a central thesis that this cannabis could be a vehicle for other people to get off of opioids. And over the last 3 years, we've seen close to 100,000 patients in California. And the personal anecdotal stories bear out that pattern as well. So about a year ago, we partnered with UC Berkeley and did one of the largest studies to date on chronic pain, opioids, and cannabis.
Okay.
And that included 3,000 patients. So the interesting thing about that, and I have to clarify, it was an observational study, which is different than a clinical study.
Yes.
Is that 97% of patients came back and said that they strongly agreed that using cannabis along with their opioids allowed them to drop their opioid use.
97%.
Yeah. Now that's about double any other study that's been done. It's usually around 47-50%. 81% of those people said that it was actually cannabis was more effective than opioids.
I've heard this.
So there's a New Mexico study that's out there, and there's a lot of different studies and data points out there. But one of the most interesting things is that we know that cannabis helps with chronic pain. Not just opioids aside, it helps most people with chronic pain. The interesting thing is that after a huge campaign by the pharmaceutical industry to get Americans hooked, what we're finding is that opioids are appropriate for acute pain, which is you break your leg, you have a hospital visit, you have surgery.
Yep.
1 or 2 days of opioids helps with intense acute pain. Studies are showing that it's ineffective
On the long term.
long-term chronic pain.
Yeah.
And it actually can exacerbate it. And it's the way it rewires our brain. So, I think it's really important for anyone that goes to a dentist or to a doctor, if they're given opioids, that they assess their own pain level and that they not get more than a couple of days of opioids. Because it's after you get over those 2 or 3 days of taking opioids that your chance of becoming addicted skyrockets.
Right? Yeah, I think it's 7 days, 6 or 7 days.
Right.
You have a 25% higher chance of becoming an addict, correct?
And so, and we can talk a lot more about that.
Well, the other data that I find interesting is that U.S. states with medical cannabis laws are reporting 25% lower opioid overdose mortality rate.
Yeah.
I mean, that's now recent.
Well, and that's patient-driven. What's so interesting about that is that when you look at that, why is that the case? It's not that the doctors and the nurses are saying to patients, use cannabis.
No, they're not.
It's that people find cannabis on their own, and I think it's just because it's much more tolerable within those societies and cultures of those states. But the other way to look at it is, in those states, general practitioners prescribe on average 1,800 less doses of opioids per practice per year.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Because the patients are saying, I don't want them?
Yeah.
because they have an alternative.
Yeah. So that's just the other way of looking at that same data. So it's pretty big stuff. So when you're looking at that and you're looking at medical states that medical marijuana states where it's legal, it is really important that the doctors start to understand how cannabis works with the body, that we have an endocannabinoid system within our bodies, that we have these CB1 and CB2 receptors, because I think until that happens, you're not going to see the significant drop that we should be seeing in medically legal states. So I think 25% is a great start, but we should be at 70%.
You can see it going higher.
We should be at 75%.
Amazing. You're really optimistic about that.
Well, I think long term.
You have to. So agree or disagree, the treatment of pain has become a politicized business in the United States.
Okay, so I have a lot to say.
Do you want to talk about this for a few minutes?
Okay, so for the last 10 years, the pharmaceutical industry has spent $880 million. Pharmaceutical industry and opioid-friendly lobbies have spent $880 million in lobbying Washington and politicians. That's 8 times more than the gun lobby. And when I look at that, look where we've ended up with the gun lobby. Look where we've ended up. Where 91, and the stats are going even higher. 91 people are dying every single day, and I just read something that it can be as close as to 145. 31 women are dying every single day of opioid, overdose. At the same time, we have a federal government that seems complicit with this. Right now, we have Governor Chris Christie, who's completely anti-cannabis. He's standing as the chief opioid abuse commissioner. And who's his main advisor of how the American people are going to get off of pharmaceuticals? It's Purdue Pharmaceutical. So Purdue Pharmaceutical is writing the rules on how to get Americans off of opioids when they are the main players that got us hooked on opioids to begin with. And to give a little bit of context.
And they make, what drug does Purdue make?
Oxycontin. So in 1996, Oxycontin came to the market, and we had seen a steady growth from 1980 of opioid deaths, but nothing like the hockey stick that we see today. What Purdue did was they started an advertising campaign that went on for quite some time, where they claimed that more people should be using opioids because they're more effective. They stated that less than 1% of opioid users become addicted, and they coined the term pseudo-addiction. They said that people have pseudo-addiction to opioids when in fact it's a relief-seeking behavior. So Purdue was the main player in getting this message out to the people, and also convincing the doctors who had opiophobia. They didn't want to prescribe opioids. They put forward data and research that was false. So it's not that the doctors wanted to get us hooked. It's that they were taught and coached
over a number of years.
But from 1996 to 2007, we saw a hockey stick of opioid addiction and mortality rates. In 2007, Purdue Pharmaceutical paid out $686 million in fines to the federal government. Why? Because of the misbranding and mismarketing. So the government has understood that the opioid epidemic has been an opioid epidemic for the last 10 years. Yet, going back to Governor Christie, we have Purdue Pharmaceuticals at the main seat of the table. We have Tom Marino, one of the head architects of trying to get the DEA to get off of the opioid epidemic, who almost has one of the biggest positions in the United States. So when you ask me what I think about the federal government being complicit in this, I think there's no shadow, it's not a shadow of doubt. Yeah, and so unfortunately, and this is the really unfortunate part about all of this, is that Purdue Pharmaceuticals is not stopping with the United States.
They are not.
They understand that the opioid sales here is on a plateau, right? Because now there is a big crackdown. But if you look at a heat map of where they are going in the rest of the globe, it is country after country where they're using the same marketing tactics. Yeah. So Same ones.
Europe or Asia or Africa, where are they heading?
All over. If I could show you the map right now, and I'll send it to you afterwards.
I'd love to see it.
Yeah, it is shocking. It's at least 10 other countries around the world.
You think these people are like global criminals. That's all I can think of them as. I see no moral, ethical, medical position they have to stand on.
Yeah, I don't really understand. And I do think that, I was talking to somebody the other day, I'm sure there are a lot of people that were working at those pharmaceutical companies for a long time that thought that they were helping the American people and people at large, and I get that. But at a certain point when you become educated, you have to say enough is enough. But clearly, this is about money, as so many other things, as people die.
Yeah, it's a very sad thing. It's a very, very sad thing. Do you have any experience with folks do a lot of people who are addicted to opiates call Hello MD? I mean, are they aware that they have an alternative?
I think that what we find, and going back to the fact that I think a lot of people realize opioids don't work for themselves at a certain point in their life. Either they're housebound, they're becoming a zombie, they have an intervention, or they just understand something about themselves, and so somebody mentions cannabis to them. But
the word is not out.
The word is not out yet, but that's what our job in this coming year at Hello MD is. We have a community that we're releasing around opioids. We're going out and speaking to people and engaging the community that cannabis is a potential exit drug to the opioid epidemic. We're engaging policymakers, regulators. I view it as one of my top priorities to go out and speak about this topic, because I don't think enough people understand. And every person in the United States is affected by the opioid epidemic on a personal level, whether they know it or not, because the amount of people that come to me as highly functioning opioid addicts, and they say, you know what you're saying resonates with me because I've been addicted to opioids for 10 years and nobody knows it.
So you can work, you go to work, you do your whole thing.
Right. You have this idea of what an opioid addict is, and yes, there's a large percentage of people that do fall into that category where they go down into the heroin, fentanyl, horrible depths that can take you. But on the flip side, there are people that titrate their opioids to deal with their chronic pain or to deal with their whatever they're trying to deal with. And it hasn't necessarily dealt with it, but they're hooked. And that doesn't even mention people that are hooked on Xanax and Ambien and all of that. And so
and you live in New York, you know a lot of those people.
Yeah. And so, my heart goes out because you have been rewired. You've been assimilated. I think about it as an assimilation.
Does it actually rewire the brain?
It does. And I was talking to a psychologist who has a fair amount of people that are hooked on Ambien, Xanax, opiates, and she said that what people don't understand is that it actually does reconstruct the way you perceive pain and perceive different things, and so you can't just drop it. I've known people that use cannabis and they are able to drop down their opioid intake to a much more manageable, reasonable level, but they haven't yet been able to drop it completely. Because your body is so habituated.
Now I understand. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah. So and I think that's a really important point for people to grasp, is that sometimes for some people dropping the opioids completely could be a multi-year process. And I'm not a doctor. It's just what I see and what I hear.
You hear these stories everywhere. Let's talk to something we spoke about briefly a couple of weeks ago when we first met, the price of cannabis medicines. Now, I did a story on this for Leafly, and I was so shocked to see the price of CBD meds, especially those derived from hemp, which are effective medications. But hemp grows like grass. No pun intended there. It's very inexpensive to grow. It's inexpensive to import. It's not expensive to process. And yet the price of these things is sometimes upward of $7 a pill, which if you compare to aspirin, which is about 15 cents a pill, is just it's unsustainable.
Right.
And I feel very bad for people who are trying to use cannabis meds at these prices.
Absolutely.
I've asked people, do you think, what is it a function of? Is it greed? Is it early market? What is it? And most people sort of throw the question aside. They say, it's going to change, it's going to change. I do think it's a question of greed. What do you think it is?
Well, I think it depends on the brand the medication, the state you're in. And I say state as in the physical state in the United States. What state do you live in? Hemp is a slightly different beast than cannabis-derived whole plant medicine. I'm not as familiar with the hemp markets. But in terms of whole plant medication, you basically are, the price is determined by the taxation structure, right? How they are manufacturing the medication, and whether there's competition, right? I mean, what I'm a big believer in is a free market, and unfortunately, within cannabis, we're not really able to. We are not. California has been more of a free market over the last 20 years, and so when you say that something's $7 a pill, I'm far less likely to see that kind of price structure in California under the current system today. Come 2018, I'm going to be very interested to see the market reaction, because we're still going to have free market competition, but you're going to have a taxation structure and all sorts of different regulatory controls that could drive the cost way up. And when that happens, I'm interested to see how people react. Which won't be positive.
No, look, it could be a disaster for the cannabis business. But I was really looking at hemp-derived products simply because we can move them around through state borders, and they're much more accessible at this point than. I mean, cannabis CBD is hard to find. I get it. I understand why that might be expensive.
Well, I think also
I just can't understand why hemp is expensive.
Well, I think that hemp too. I mean, we have to look at the fact that hemp. To get high quality hemp, we're not able to really harvest that here in the United States based on the regulations. You can do it. You can do it in New York,
and Vermont, and Colorado. Like, one of the companies I really loved was this company out of Vermont called Green Mountain CBD, and they're harvesting their own, farming it, processing it. It's $1 a pill. A Vermont company. These two young guys. Give them a lot of credit. And they're small. They're tiny. They're not really doing it to scale. Imagine if it was done to scale. Another company is called Infinite CBD out of Colorado, and they make an interesting product, by the way. They make a pill that a daytime CBD that has 100 milligrams of caffeine, a cup of coffee, and a nighttime CBD with 3 milligrams of melatonin.
That's great.
It's great.
I love it.
And the daytime is a white pill, and the nighttime is a black pill. I think they have both a cannabis and a hemp drug. $1 a pill.
Yeah.
$1 a pill, nicely packaged. I've been using them for the last month. I'm my own little guinea pig,
right?
And I like them very much.
Well, I think it's determined by what the market is willing to pay too.
Clearly.
Right, and if they're willing to pay that, I think
it's also by people don't know.
People don't know. I mean, there's so many different factors that go into pricing, but there is price gouging in this industry, as within any industry. Unfortunately, this is not covered by insurance, and it's this is totally out of pocket. So when I see the $7 a pill, and there was a brand that I was just introduced in California, loved it, $7 a pill. You're not going to survive.
You're just not going to survive. This is brought up because you said the ramp up to cannabis medicine at the top of the show was about $1,500 when you're just finding your way through all the different products and possibilities and delivery systems.
And you're those people, the people that really do that. You have a problem. You're dedicated to finding.
You're going to find
my solution
to that. Absolutely, yeah.
So that's a certain kind of person.
Yeah. So, what's next for Hello MD?
So this quarter we're very focused on launching our marketplace in California. So people will we call it the life cycle of the cannabis patient or the cannabis journey. So we'll be able to complete that cycle where people will actually be able to purchase products. So we're very excited about that. We're launching communities that are based around disease states and points of interest. So we're going to be doing a power community around opioid addiction and several other power communities. And we're relaunching our platform this coming week, which is a whole new user experience. So we're excited about that. But we're also looking to moving into new areas from a medical perspective and offering our service in different states and actually outside of the country. So we're excited about that.
Germany?
Perhaps. And we're also still working on, on furthering the research that we've been doing. So we did one of the largest CBD studies to date recently, which also included hemp. And so we're partnering with another large institution for our next research project, but we haven't disclosed what that is yet. But the research and the observational studies, this one will be a little bit more formalized study. We're excited to just keep moving that conversation forward.
Great. I'm so glad you joined me today. For the listeners, it's hellomd.com, correct?
Correct.
Check it out. It's a great resource. Tons of information, maybe too much information, I'm not sure, but it's a great resource and I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, that was really nice.
Yeah,
I really
Pamela's
enjoyed that.
a special person, a special woman, really. And it's also great to see more women entering the cannabis space as time goes on. This has to happen. It's going to happen. And she's a shining star in it. Didn't your mother have an opioid issue at some point, Matthew?
Yeah, and honestly still does. It's something that we've been working with. My mother has fibromyalgia, has struggled with that for many years, and was basically just told by an addiction specialist to just continue to take opioids for the rest of her life because coming down from the addiction would be worse than
and fibromyalgia
being
is
addicted.
an intractable pain condition, right?
Yeah, it's like a degenerative nerve disease. You're in chronic pain, a lot in the extremities, the hands, the feet, and it just works its way up to your core as it progresses.
Well, I'm writing a course for patients, an online dosing course that addresses pain, insomnia, and stress, which are the three most popular illnesses for which people use cannabis. And I'm almost done with it. I'm going to send your mom a copy of this course. Do you think she'd be open to reading it and using it?
Oh, I've been talking with her. She's open to the idea of cannabis to deal with pain, to hopefully lift her spirits a little bit. And I think that this interview that we just shared is going to be another great step forward to getting her to open her mind to this.
Well, Mrs. Hendershot, I hope you listen. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you find some relief. Feel free to call me, and I'll send you an early version of the course I'm working on. So this really wraps up our first season of the Brave New Weed podcast, correct? This is going to be our last episode for the year.
It is indeed. We are 17 episodes strong for season 1 of Brave New Weedcast. It's been an absolute pleasure this year to go through this with you, Joe. And I'm looking forward to kicking off 2018 with some big news.
Listen, me too. We've got some great people lined up, but I also want to encourage our listeners to share this podcast widely. We've got a great base. We're getting a lot of downloads a month for a bunch of people who do this out of love. And it would be great if every one of you could just share it with somebody, encourage them to sign on, encourage them to become a Patreon sponsor. Honestly, you can do it for $1 a month. This is the way we'll be able to continue doing what we're doing. So I wish you all a good holiday season. I wish you a happy new year, and we look forward to seeing you back in January of 2018.
I know I'm going to be there.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. All right.
Cheers, Joe.
Bye,
Enjoy
Matthew.
your holiday.
Happy holiday.
See you in the new year.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Brave New Weed podcast. This episode and all future episodes are made possible by amazing listeners like yourself. If you like what you've heard, we encourage you to show your support by giving $1 a month for special access and rewards on patreon.com/bravenewweed. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram via @bravenewweed. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/bravenewweed. And remember, you can always find more information about us or information discussed in each episode by pointing your favorite browser to bravenewweed.com.